Hey guys, what's up? In this video, I'm going to be breaking down the Logitech webcam settings, explaining what each of them does, why they react the way they do, and give you the understanding that you need to get the best image possible. As an example, this is the image out of my EOS R6 compared to my Logitech C920. Let's dive in. Few quick starting notes. For my environment, I am using an Elgato key light with the color temperature set to 4200 Kelvin and the brightness set to 60%, which should come out to somewhere around 1700 lumens. As I mentioned, my primary camera is the EOS R6 that you're seeing here, and that's the camera that we'll be using to help explain the settings that we have inside our web camera settings. With that out of the way, let's jump into G-Hub. Opening up G-Hub, we want to come up to the settings. We're going to go to gear, then we're going to scroll over to our webcam, and we're going to disable this device in G-Hub to allow other software to have full control. Now, what this is going to do is this is going to allow OBS to have full control per se over our webcam, meaning more so that the G-Hub software and the profiles saved in it are no longer going to influence or mess with the settings that we create in OBS for our webcam. Now, this does come with a downside though, because since those aren't being saved in G-Hub, our settings that we set in OBS are actually going to be lost every time that we restart our computer. Now, in my opinion, it's a small price to pay. It is unfortunate, but we are going to get a pretty nice looking image out of our work. So, now, if Logitech would just add a gain slider into G-Hub, we'd all be sitting pretty fine. But I digress. With that applied, we can then jump into OBS. Now, in one of our last videos where we set up a basic scene, we left most of our webcam settings alone. We just left them set to default. Today, we're going to go ahead and go through and we're going to set those to their actual settings, or at least as many of them as we can. So, selecting our Logitech webcam, we're going to go ahead and we're going to right click, we're going to go into properties, and we're presented with somewhat of a familiar looking dialog window. You notice we're sideways because I actually have my camera mounted sideways. For the device, we have that set to our webcam, our C920, and then that's followed by a whole host of different settings. I'm going to go ahead and reset all these to default so that we can go through them together. And then I'm also going to go ahead and default out our other settings here. That should more or less default them out. All right, so there's a few things that we want to change inside of our properties window here. For our resolution FPS type, now the device default seems to be 720p. So we want to change this to custom. And when we do that, in our resolution, we're going to get the option for 1920 by 1080. So we're going to select that. And then we get our full sensor readout. We're getting our full 1920 by 1080. And for our FPS, we can either leave this on match output or we can set it for 30. We know from the spec sheet that our webcam runs at 1080p at 30 frames a second, and that is a solid 30 frames a second. It's not the 29.97, not the NTSC standard, but it is 30 frames per second. Now you'll notice that our video is now completely blown out, but we're going to get to fixing that in a moment. Continuing down those, we've got video format, and we have two options here. We're not going to worry about this really. We're just going to leave that on any because it's working fine and I see no need to play with that. Color space though, we are going to change, and color space is important here. I've seen that some people will set their color space to 601, and that's actually not correct. The color space is 709. Rec 601 or BT 601 is a video standard from 1982, published as a standard for standard definition video content. I mean, this was back before HD TVs. Rec 709 by comparison was published in 1993 and is the specification used for HD content, and it is still the specification used for HD content today. 720p and 1080p are both considered HD content, so we definitely want this on 709. Color range, we can then either leave this on default or apparently this camera is actually running on full, which I find a little bit confusing. And for a breakdown on the differences between full and partial, go ahead and check out the video in the description below by epos, where he talks about the differences between partial and full and how that can affect the colors that you're getting in your video. However, in my testing, I found that the camera, that the C920 does indeed seem to run on full, which was quite surprising, and I actually was getting better color with it, so we're going full, even though it should be partial, but for some reason it's full. Anyhow, buffering we're going to go ahead and leave alone. We're not going to worry about any of the other things here. These should all be matching our camera's output settings now. It's native settings. We're going to be able to go ahead and click configure video. So with those changes made, we're now able to click on the configure video. This will open up our webcam's properties. You may be familiar with many of the settings that we're going to see in here if you're familiar with working with photos or video content. Our settings are broken up into two groups, the video processing amplifier group and the camera control group. Taking a note from Adobe's Photoshop documentation, we can find some nice descriptions for some of the things that we see in here. For example, when looking at our brightness and contrast adjustments, these let you make simple adjustments to the tonal range of an image. Moving the brightness slider to the right increases the tonal values and expands image highlights. Moving it to the left decreases values and expands shadows. Contrast slider expands or shrinks the overall tonal range of values in the image. The saturation slider is going to affect the level of saturation that we have in our image. To the right is going to increase that saturation. To the left is going to decrease that saturation. Similarly, sharpness, if we drag it to the right, will increase sharpness in our image, and to the left will decrease the sharpness. Each of these sliders has a midpoint of 128 with the range going from 0 to 225. Now we won't really be adjusting any of these except maybe the sharpness a little bit, but we'll save that till towards the end. Continuing down, we have white balance, which determines the white point of our image. Now we want this to match as closely as possible the light in our room. Now I mentioned at the start of my video that I'm using an Elgato key light set for 4200 Kelvin. So we're going to set this as close as we can to that. Right now we've already got it on 4000, we're just going to bump it up a little bit. 4190 is the closest we're going to get. We're going to go ahead and hit apply, and that's going to set our white balance. Now if my light was set warmer, let's say 2900 Kelvin, we would drag the slider to the left, which would cool off the image for that warm light. Or if I was using something much brighter and more white, like say 6500 Kelvin, which is about daylight color, then we'd want to introduce more warm tones. We'd slide that white balance to the right, and it would counteract that to get us a more white image. However, I didn't really find the C920 to handle either of those extremes too well. Those are basically the range that my key light supports. I found that right here at 4200 was actually pretty pleasing, and it also seemed the most pleasing to work in. The 2900 Kelvin was simply way too orange, and the 6500 Kelvin was just so bright and white. It was hard to game at the same time. But figure out which one works for you and go with that. You can also leave it on auto. However, I wouldn't use auto if you know what your white balance needs to be set to, because leaving it on auto will have it adjusting back and forth some, and it's easier just to set it and forget it. Continuing down to backlight compensation. Backlight compensation, I suspect, is related to Logitech's right light. And as lighting in our scene here isn't really of a concern, we've just slid this down to off because we're not going to be needing that. Now we're going to skip over gain for a moment and go into our camera control settings. Focus we're going to take off of auto, which we don't really need to, but seeing as I will pretty much always be more than 2 feet away from the Logitech, which seems to be the upper limit of its focal range, we're just going to leave it set to 0. Now if we were sitting closer to that and we want to get a little bit of a blurred background effect, we could drag it to the right some and find what that focal point would be. We can use my blown out Lamborghini here as an example, but we're pretty much always going to be sitting farther back than that, so we're just going to leave it at 0. Now exposure is another one we're going to come back to in a minute, but the exposure and the gain are going to be two very important settings, and I'm going to explain how these work and how they relate to actual camera settings in just a minute. Pan and tilt we don't really need to worry about, seeing as we're not using the zoom at all. If we were zooming in and cropping some, we might use the pan and tilt in order to center our image, but we don't need to worry about those. Low light compensation we're also going to uncheck because, as I said before, we have plenty of light. We don't need any low light compensation. So I'm going to uncheck that, uncheck the auto exposure if you still have that checked. And let's dive into explaining what the gain and exposure are actually doing. So stacking these two images side by side, we're going to be able to play with them side by side and you're going to be able to see what's actually going on. Now, I'm also going to drop in the webcam settings here so that you can see as we're dragging the slider back and forth what's happening. To help explain what's going on here, let's have a quick foundational overview. When capturing photos or videos, there are three different components that we balance in order to get a well-exposed image. These are the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed. When dialed in properly, we get a nice pleasing image. When not, well, we look like our webcam. On something like a DSLR, a mirrorless camera, or a video camera, all these settings are relatively easy to change and control. However, on a webcam, they're not quite as straightforward. With our webcam, one of these settings is permanent in fact, meaning that we have no influence over it, and that setting is the aperture. Generally, for sensors of this nature, I believe it's common to see apertures between an f1 and an f2, and with the Logitech Stream Cams sporting an aperture of f2, I think it's safe to assume that the C920 similarly has an aperture of f2. So we're not really going to be able to adjust the aperture to help with our image. That leaves us with shutter speed and ISO. As it turns out, the shutter speed settings map to the camera control group that we have in our Logitech webcam properties. And that means then that our ISO maps to our gain. And this makes a fair bit of sense. And we can even do a quick sanity check and confirm this. Let's tackle the exposure slider first. Shutter speed determines how long the shutter is open for, which is how long light is allowed to touch the image sensor for. Longer shutter speeds allow light in for a longer period of time, and shorter shutter speeds allow light in for a shorter amount of time. In photography, you would use a long shutter speed to capture something like a nightscape or trailing taillights. For something like high action sports, you'd want to use a very short shutter speed that will allow you to freeze the action. Similarly, in video, we use a similar approach as it pertains to frame rate and shutter speed. Now, typically for video, you want your shutter speed to be double what your frame rate is. If I'm recording at 60 frames a second, I want my shutter speed to be 1/125. However, I can bring that down to as low as 1/60. At this point, my shutter speed and my frame rate match up. And you'll notice that without changing any other settings, our scene has gotten brighter, our exposure has come up. If I go any lower though, my shutter is then going to be lagging behind my frame rate. Or in other words, the shutter is going to be open for multiple frames, which is going to create something like a smearing or a blur effect. For example, we can kind of see this already even just at 1/60. If we go back to our 1/125, you can see our hand's decently crisp. Drop down to 1/60, things start to blur a little bit. If we go even lower, let's say 1/30, at this point our shutter is now open for a full 2 frames. So in a way we're kind of getting 2 repeat frames. And you can see even though we're still at 60 frames a second, it's becoming increasingly blurry and we're getting increasingly exposed. Now let's go a little extreme, drop it all the way down to 1/20. EOS R6 image is starting to look quite a bit like our Logitech webcam image. And you can see, even though we're still at 60 frames a second, our frame rate has not changed. What has changed is our shutter speed. And the result of that is a blurry smearing effect because our shutter is being left open for multiple frames, causing that blur effect to be what's being captured. Now, one of the things that a low shutter speed can help with is very low light situations. However, it creates a poor viewing experience. And this is what we see with our exposure slider dragged towards 0. You know, if we drag it any more towards 0, you notice that things start to blur more, you know, we're just like really blown out, but our shutter speed is obviously quite slow. The frame rate on our webcam has remained at 30 frames a second. So the webcam is not lagging, we're not having issues there. What has changed is the duration that the shutter is being left open for, which creates that blurring effect. So if we go ahead and drag our exposure slider to the left then, If we bring it down to about -6, maybe -7, let's go ahead and go for -6 because as we saw, our gain is really high and we're tackling our gain next. So let's put it on 6 for now. I already know that's where we're going to want it to be, so let's go ahead and stick that on 6. So as you can see now, that gives us a much crisper image because our shutter speed isn't lagging behind our frame rate now. Now, I don't know what -6 necessarily correlates to, but it seems to be that anything that is -5 or below seems to at the least get us over that 1/30 threshold for our shutter speed so that we don't really have blurry video. Now that leaves our gain, which on our camera would translate to our ISO. Our ISO value determines how sensitive our image sensor is to light. Greater sensitivity results in better low light performance and low light images. However, the more sensitive you make your image sensor to light, the more noise gets introduced. And this is exactly what we're seeing here with the gain slider. Currently our gain's up pretty high, and if we drag it just a little bit higher, the noise that we're getting in our webcam image becomes a little bit more obvious. Now we've pretty much got it drug up all the way, and you can see it might not be super obvious, but there is noise that we're getting in what are the darker areas of our scene. Now we can demonstrate the same thing with the R6, but we have to crank the ISO way up. In fact, we probably even need to turn off that room light in order to get this high enough. So the R6 has a really good sensor, so it's looking like we're kind of struggling to get the noise to pull out. What we can do is we can turn off our key light, and we can crank our ISO way in the heck up on the R6, and now, there we go, now you can see the noise. So you can see with 0 lights on in my room, it's fairly dark in here. You can see the only light I've got for my webcam is just coming from my monitors. We can bump our ISO up high enough that we can get a usable image with the R6, but there's a lot of noise being introduced, or that is visible at this point, because of how sensitive we've made that image, because of how much we've boosted that. So generally speaking, we want our ISO to be as low as possible. To avoid things like introducing noise into our images. Sometimes raising the ISO may be necessary depending on what aperture settings and what shutter speeds you have available and how you're trying to compose your image. But in our case, luckily we have enough light that we can drop our ISO pretty much all the way down. So for our webcam, we're going to drop that all the way to 0. And now you can see in our webcam, all of the noise is gone, our dark areas are dark, we are pretty decently exposed, and our image looks 100 times better than when we started. Now optimally for a camera like the C920, if you don't have enough lighting available to drop your gain all the way down to 0, make sure that your exposure doesn't come up above -5, because once it goes above -5, that's when your shutter speed is going to be longer than your frame rate and you're going to start getting those blur effects. So if your lighting situation is such that -5 is the lowest that you're able to go with your exposure, at that point use the gain slider to help boost the ISO a little bit to bring your image up to a pleasing exposure level. With this understanding, you should now be able to go out and get your webcam settings dialed in so that you can get awesome images just like this one. If this video has helped you get a better looking image out of your webcam, hit that like button, subscribe for future content, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. So long.